My role this morning is to try to set the backcloth for the discussion on rural transformation in sub-Saharan Africa. And what I specifically would like to do is to draw on some of the emerging lessons from the emerging economies of Brazil, China, India and South Africa, and base my comments on a major international conference that was held in India in 2010. First, to say that between the four countries of Brazil, China, India and South Africa, their rural societies represent 25% of the world's population. And what happens in those countries is going to be key, not only within those countries, to the world as a whole. And what we're seeing in those countries is a transformation process that is taking place at a level which has been unprecedented in history. In European or North American and so on history, the numbers and scale are unprecedented. And it's also taking place at a time of very significant uncertainty. The issues of climate change, the impacts of growing scarcity of water and land, and the triple impacts of food, energy and financial crises. So this rapid change is creating enormous risk and vulnerability for rural poor people, as well as new opportunities in renewable energy, the provision of environmental services, and in food production. And this process of change is even more complex when we add onto it the heavy burden of historical inheritances of poverty, inequality, injustice, dual agricultural systems, lack of rights of marginalised large groups of the population, of women, tribal groups, indigenous populations, poor and inadequate access to health and education and basic services, and insufficient public and private sector investment. But despite these inheritances, ultimate success can really be based on the evidence of the impressive achievements to date in these countries. Whilst the outcome has not been uniform across and between countries, much has been achieved in the last 20 to 30 years, and we need to build on that. Millions of people have indeed been lifted out of poverty. Food production has increased many times since the famines of the 50s and 60s. Natural resources and ecosystems can no longer be destroyed with obscurity and with impunity. Thousands of small and medium firms have been formed in rural areas and contributing to national and global economies. More men and women are going to school than their earlier generation, and governments are becoming increasingly accountable to their citizens and civil society. Now, if we take these four countries, we could say, well, there are four different countries, four different approaches. And in your reader, there's some more background on each of the countries. And indeed, in the conference proceedings and all the papers that are available on the websites, which I'll give you at the end of my presentation, there's a great richness which sub-Saharan Africa can drill into. But to suffice to say, the picture is very different, for example, between India and China, with not significantly different population scales, but very different sizes of rural population, with a 70% rural population in India, whereas it's round about 55% in China, with a view in the next 20 years that the Chinese population in rural areas will decline to about 30 to 35%. Now, China, over the last 30 years, has made significant investment in rural industrialization and in manufacturing and in other industries, non-agricultural industries. And that, together with support to agriculture, has lifted many of the rural populations out of agriculture and into other enterprises. But agriculture still remains central to the rural economy and to the economy in China. And the new focus is to build on food security, to strengthen value chains, to strengthen agribusiness, to build jobs in rural areas, as well as support through social welfare programs. India, in contrast, has had many interventions in rural areas, and now with its new 5-year plan has multiple rural interventions, but has not dismantled many of its old silos from other programs and carries that burden as it takes rural development forward. And India has, for example, the world's largest rural employment guarantee scheme in operation at the moment. Brazil and South Africa, in some ways similar but very different, of course, have very strongly dual agricultural systems. Brazil, since the early 2000s, has had a very strong program of support to small-scale farmers, and more recently has been looking at new and innovative ways to look at the territorial space of rural and urban space and look at new institutions that can build sort of bottom-up coalitions and more accountability of service provision. South Africa has gone through a series of multiple rural development programme planning processes and has now finally settled on their comprehensive rural development programme, which again is strongly agrarian-based. Next, please. Thank you. So out of this conference emerged a vision that rural transformation is about human development. It is not about simply the development of assets. And the 4 countries could agree to 3 broad pillars of approach, and I'm going to run through the key elements of that. First is the need for continued and significant investment in rural areas. Second is the need for the right governance systems, institutions and policy processes. And fourth, to look at the effectiveness of public policy intervention and its efficiency. Next, please. So the imperatives for rural transformation must be the reduction of poverty and specifically the reduction of inequality within rural areas and between rural and urban space. Not only those inherited from past policies and social structures, but the new poverties and the new inequalities that are being created by rural transformation itself. So we need to be alert to that. All of the 4 countries gave significant focus to the importance of food security and accelerating agricultural development as a central plank of rural transformation, and in particular, securing the relevant role of small-scale family farming in national, regional and global value chains. Thirdly, the creation of jobs, including the strengthening, next please, the strengthening of small and medium-sized towns. Specifically, there needs to be, in their view of these countries, a focus on stimulating the role of rural, small towns and intermediate cities and strengthening the linkage between that rural space and that urban space in terms of services and the flows of goods, markets and people, and managing the complex and sensitive issue of rural-urban migration. Meeting the challenges of climate change and taking advantage of these in the context of rural development, where many of these renewable resources can themselves create jobs in the rural space. Securing universal public services of education, health and the provision of transport and communication, including upgrading of the quality standards of that provision. Continuing the focus on land reform and land tenure systems, including enabling populations to move out of that rural space and into non-agricultural jobs. So the land reform systems need to be sensitive to that transformation. And looking at the provision of financial services and credit access. Finally, in this context, looking and promoting innovation, research and development to meet the needs of rural people and rural businesses, and making much better use, as was mentioned earlier, of the role of the ICT revolution in rural change. And finally, putting in place complementary social support schemes of cash transfers, pensions, employment guarantee schemes to ensure that the basic human dignity of all rural dwellers is enabled. So the second pillar of the programme, of the emerging debate from the conference, was that many of the countries have learned through very painful experiences that rural transformation is not just about hard investment. It is about governance, it's about people, it's about social participation and social coalitions as they move forward. And the quote from the minister from China was that rural change will be easy if it was only a matter of bricks and mortar. It's not. It's about people. So in terms of governance, institutions and policy challenges, in looking at rural development, we need to reaffirm that rural is no longer synonymous of just agriculture and food production. It is much more than that. It includes also small towns and intermediate cities. It is more than male farmers. It includes female farmers and a very much diversified economy. And so the agro-sectoral lens of the past needs to be replaced by a place-based lens that recognises the interconnections between this territory, this rural territory, which may include small urban towns, and that link within the national, regional and global economies. And rural development, as was mentioned in the introduction, should no longer live in the shadow of urban development. It calls for a new paradigm, a new profile for rural to be valued in the national and regional and global economies. One of the key challenges is the need to look at how to deal with cross-sectoral coordination between the sectors of education, agriculture, health, environment, infrastructure, and how to look at the structures between national government, meso-governments and local government. And it's this institutional architecture combined with these new coalitions between state, market and civil society, which is going to be critical to the way in which the rural transformation moves forward. Can we just slip back again, please? Just one more slide. Need to build local accountable governments and need to look at new public-private partnerships. Thank you. Clearly, rural areas are not homogeneous. They're very diverse, and one needs to understand that heterogeneity and looking particularly at the challenges of some of the more disadvantaged regions. Refashioning the agenda for gender relations to ensure that operations are based on equity between gender, and strengthening civil society processes so that civil society themselves can contribute to and be the driver of transformation. And finally, looking at the efficiency and effectiveness of public policy and programmes. All of those 4 countries, despite their many years of experience of trying to work through rural transformation processes, are challenged by the relationship between the investment and the outcome. And they're calling for new benchmarks, new means to measure the processes of change in rural area. And also asking the very big question, how to sequence priorities within rural transformation, given the multiple challenges that are being faced. And developing better monitoring and evaluation systems to ensure that evidence-based policy is informed by the learning from monitoring and evaluation and from research. Next, please. Now, in your presentation, I've listed many of the areas which these 4 countries have highlighted as important for shared learning. They believe that they can benefit through shared learning between China and Brazil, India and South Africa in order to address the challenges of rural transformation. They know that they don't have the answers on how to deal with all the pressing questions. And so there is a call for shared learning based on empirical evidence, based on new models of functioning. And I'll just pick a couple of these which are important. One is how to develop the right institutional structures that break down the sectoral barriers within that rural space between economic and social service provision. How to address the challenges of job creation in rural areas. And if I could just move to my last slide, please. Thank you. A slide before last, thank you. So I'm not going to be able to go through each of those areas for learning which the emerging economies have raised as being important. But suffice to say that they believe that's important as they move forward. And I believe for sub-Saharan Africa that opportunities to share between countries in Latin America and Asia on how they've approached different models of rural transformation, and indeed to bring the good practice from sub-Saharan Africa into some of those countries on how sub-Saharan Africa has addressed some of the challenging issues of development is important. So my last slide, and it's in your power pack. The conference website is over 80 papers, including the strategic position papers of each of those 4 countries, and many of the interventions that are linked to rural transformation, along with a conference report, which is also on the website. And I think that will provide a rich source of material for you as you move forward. Thank you very much.